My dear friends, have you ever thought that a bustling city, alive with music and autumn colors, could still hide secrets powerful enough to leave everyone stunned? Memphis, long known for its soulful jazz on Beale Street, its rich culture, and its resilient people, carried such a secret. But then, in the fall of 2012, a shocking event unfolded. Inside a solemn courtroom, packed with reporters, lawyers, and citizens, a police officer who had worn the uniform for more than 12 years suddenly removed her badge and slipped off her jacket before the eyes of the judge, the attorneys, and the entire public gallery. That bold act did more than silence the room. It revealed a painful truth. Sometimes justice is not upheld by those sworn to protect it, but by the ones brave enough to break the silence. Before we dive deeper together into this mysterious journey, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on Justice Voice and turn on the notification bell. That way, every thrilling and surprising story will always reach you first. In the fall of 2012, the city of Memphis carried a heavy silence beneath its noisy streets. The trees along Beale Street had just begun to trade their green for shades of copper and gold, yet the crisp air of autumn could not cool the simmering tension that lingered in the city. For months, news outlets had been filled with stories of police misconduct, and neighborhoods once thick with trust now pulsed with suspicion. Mothers walked their children to school with wary eyes, and fathers returned home from long shifts, wondering if the people sworn to protect them were really the ones they needed protection from. Angela Carter had worn the uniform of the Memphis Police Department for nearly 12 years. At 36, she was no longer the wide-eyed rookie who had once believed the badge was a shield of honor. The years had worn her down, sanding away the bright optimism she carried when she first stepped into the academy. She had seen things she wished she could forget, fists raised against those already handcuffed reports, rewritten to hide bruises, whispers in the station that told her truth was expendable if it got in the way of the system. And still, she stayed. She stayed because of Marcus. Her brother, Marcus Carter, had been only 20 when his life was derailed. A wrongful arrest, a charge he could not defend himself against, and a sentence that stole away years he would never reclaim. Though his conviction was overturned years later, the damage lingered. Marcus carried a quiet bitterness, the kind that settled into his bones. Angela had joined the force believing that maybe, just maybe, she could change things from the inside. She thought her badge could mean something different. She thought it could restore faith for families like hers. But as she sat on the witness bench in that crowded courtroom on an October morning, Angela wondered if she had been lying to herself all along. The courthouse smelled faintly of old wood and ink, the kind of smell that belonged to rooms heavy with history and decisions that had changed lives. Reporters filled the back row, their pens poised, their cameras forbidden, but their presence loud enough. Members of the community packed the gallery, some whispering prayers, others glaring toward the row of officers seated like a wall of stone in their dark blue uniforms. At the front, Judge William Hayes, a man with silver hair and the tired eyes of someone who had seen more than his share of disappointments, adjusted his glasses and looked over the rim at the woman in uniform before him. Angela's palms were damp, her fingers twisting against each other in her lap. Across the aisle, the defense attorney, Daniel Brooks, leaned casually against the table, his smirk suggesting he had already won. He was known in Memphis as the man who could make a guilty cop look like a misunderstood saint. His job today was no different. To him, Angela was just another piece to discredit, another witness to bend until her words broke. On the other side, Rachel Moore, the prosecutor, sat upright, her gaze steady, her files neatly arranged. She had earned a reputation for fighting cases others wouldn't touch, and though she knew the odds were against her, she carried herself with the calm of someone who had chosen conviction over convenience. Angela's name was called, and the murmurs in the gallery hushed. She rose slowly, her heart thudding in her chest, and walked to the stand. Each step echoed in her ears louder than it should have. She took her seat, swore her oath, and looked out into the sea of expectant faces. Somewhere in the back row, she imagined Marcus sitting there, silent, waiting, reminding her why she had come. At first, the questions were simple. Dates, times, procedures she had followed on the night in question. She answered carefully, her voice even, though her throat felt dry. But soon the weight of the defense pressed against her. Daniel Brooks rose, his tone dripping with practiced charm, as he probed at her loyalty. "Officer Carter," he said, "would you agree that loyalty to your department is essential to maintaining order in our city?" Angela hesitated. It was the kind of question meant to trap her, To answer yes would make her look obedient but dishonest. To answer no would mark her as a traitor. She glanced down at her hands, then back up, meeting his eyes. Loyalty to justice, she replied softly, comes before loyalty to anything else. Oh. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, and the judge tapped his gavel for silence. Brooks narrowed his eyes, sensing her resistance. He leaned closer to the jury, his voice raised. So you admit, then, that you would betray your fellow officers if you thought they were in the wrong? Angela's chest tightened. Her pulse quickened. The words she wanted to say burned on her tongue, but fear pressed them back. She thought of her paycheck, the roof it paid for, the small life she had built. She thought of her badge, the one that had once gleamed with pride but now felt heavier than the gun on her hip. And then she thought of Marcus, standing behind bars in her memory, his voice echoing through the years. If you wear that badge, Angie, make it mean something. She inhaled slowly. The courtroom lights felt hotter now, the silence denser. And in that silence, as the defense waited for her answer, Angela Carter felt something within her shift. The silence in the courtroom lingered as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Angela Carter sat rigid in the witness stand, her back pressed tight against the wooden chair, her gaze fixed on the polished floor beneath her boots. Daniel Brooks's words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. So you admit, then, that you would betray your fellow officers if you thought they were in the wrong? Every eye in the room turned toward her. The jurors leaned forward, their pens paused above their notepads. The gallery sat stiff, waiting, the low hum of reporters' pens scratching across paper the only sound. Judge Hayes, perched high above them all, folded his hands and studied her with a look that revealed nothing. Angela swallowed, feeling the dry catch of her throat. To most in the room, it was a simple yes or no question. But for her, it was a chasm that split her life in two. One answer kept her safe, secured her paycheck, allowed her to keep her house and her health insurance. The other answer stripped her bare, exposed her to scorn, ridicule, and perhaps worse. She thought of her fellow officers, some of whom had once laughed with her over stale coffee at 3 a.m., others who had stood by while brutality unfolded as if it were routine. She thought of how many times she had bitten her tongue, how many times she had signed her name on reports she knew were incomplete, even dishonest. Her conscience twisted inside her like a knife. Finally, she lifted her chin. Her voice, though quiet, carried across the hushed courtroom. If telling the truth is betrayal, then I suppose I would, she said. A ripple of shock moved through the gallery. Someone gasped. Judge Hayes struck his gavel sharply, the crack of wood against wood echoing like thunder. Order, he commanded, though his eyes flickered with something unreadable, perhaps surprise, perhaps respect. Brooks smiled thinly, sensing an opening. He spread his arms wide, as if presenting her words as evidence itself. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he said, his voice rising, what you have just heard is the confession of a disloyal officer, one who places her personal feelings above her duty to the men and women who serve this city. Angela felt her stomach twist. He was twisting her words, reducing them to treachery. She clenched her fists beneath the table, her fingernails biting into her palms. She wanted to shout, to explain, but she knew better than to interrupt. In this room, Brooks held the stage, and she was just another player caught in his script. Rachel Moore, the prosecutor, stood quickly. Objection, Your Honor. Counsel is arguing rather than questioning the witness. The judge tapped his gavel once. Sustained. Mr. Brooks, ask your question. Brooks's smile never faltered. He turned back to Angela, his voice smooth but sharp. Tell us, Officer Carter, do you believe that your testimony here today is more important than the integrity of the Memphis Police Department? Angela's breath caught. She could almost feel the weight of her badge pressing against her chest, though it was pinned neatly to her uniform. The badge had once felt like a promise. Now it felt like a shackle. She closed her eyes briefly, just long enough to picture Marcus's young face on the day of his arrest, his wrists bound, his eyes pleading with her, even though she had been powerless. She remembered the long hours at the prison, sitting across from him through glass, his voice low and bitter as he told her, "This system isn't made for us, Angie. It'll break you if you let it." When she opened her eyes, something inside her had hardened. She sat taller, her voice clearer this time. I believe the truth matters more than the image of an institution, she said. The room exploded again, murmurs rushing like wind through dry leaves. Reporters scribbled frantically. A woman in the back row whispered, "God bless her." Judge Hayes banged his gavel until the noise subsided. Brooks stepped back, his expression tightening. He hadn't expected her defiance to sharpen rather than wilt under pressure. "No further questions," he muttered, though the venom in his tone lingered. Rachel Moore approached the stand for redirect. She moved carefully, her heels tapping softly against the wooden floor. "Officer Carter," she said gently, "why are you here today?" Angela turned her head, meeting Rachel's steady gaze. The prosecutor's eyes held no judgment, only quiet encouragement. Angela inhaled deeply, her chest rising and falling as if bracing against a storm. "I'm here," she said slowly, "because I saw something wrong. I'm here because the badge on my chest doesn't mean silence. It's supposed to mean service, protection, and justice. And if it doesn't mean those things, then it means nothing at all." The words left her lips like a confession, like a burden slipping free after years of weight. The silence that followed was different this time, not stunned, but reverent, as if the whole room knew they had heard something that mattered. Still, as Angela sat there, she felt the tension coil tighter inside her. The truth was dangerous, and the more she spoke it, the clearer it became that she was not walking back to her old life after this. The department would close ranks. Her colleagues would turn their backs. Her career, everything she had built for over a decade, would crumble. And yet, for the first time in years, she felt honest. The questioning ended. Judge Hayes called for a short recess. The jurors filed out, whispering among themselves. Reporters hurried to the hallway, dialing their editors. Angela sat in the stand for a moment longer, her hands trembling slightly. Then she rose and returned to the table, though her mind felt far away. During the recess, Angela walked to the small bathroom tucked beside the witness room. She splashed cold water on her face, staring into the mirror. Her reflection stared back, the uniform crisp, the badge gleaming beneath the fluorescent light. Yet the woman behind the uniform looked exhausted, hollowed out by years of compromise. "What are you doing, Angie?" she whispered to herself. "Are you ready to throw it all away?" But deep down, she knew the answer. She wasn't throwing it away. It had been stolen piece by piece the moment she started closing her eyes to injustice. What she was about to do was the only way to reclaim herself. When court resumed, the gallery buzzed with anticipation. People could sense the storm building. Angela sat quietly, her mind oddly calm, like the eye of a hurricane. Judge Hayes returned to the bench, his expression unreadable. The proceedings dragged on with other witnesses, but Angela barely heard them. She could feel the moment approaching, like a drumbeat growing louder. And when it came, when Brooks once again tried to discredit her, mocking her integrity, questioning her loyalty, something in her finally broke. She stood. The sound of her chair scraping against the wooden floor sliced through the courtroom. Every head turned. The judge froze, his gavel suspended midair. Angela's hands moved with quiet certainty. She reached to her chest and unclipped the badge, its metal catching the light one last time. Slowly, deliberately, she set it down on the wooden railing before her. Then she slipped her arms out of the sleeves of her uniform jacket. The fabric fell to the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo louder than thunder. Gasps filled the room. Reporters' pens scratched furiously. A juror's mouth hung open in disbelief. Angela stood in her plain shirt now, no longer shielded by the trappings of her profession. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. "I would rather lose this job," she said, her words ringing across the room, "than betray justice." The room went utterly silent. Even Brooks was struck dumb, his smirk wiped away. Judge Hayes lowered his gavel slowly, as though he understood that this was no moment for order. Angela's words hung in the air like a bell tolling, each syllable a strike against the silence that had allowed corruption to thrive. She stood taller than she ever had in uniform, a single figure against a system too vast to comprehend, yet in that moment, more powerful than any badge. And in the eyes of the people watching, she was no longer just Officer Carter. She was something larger, something untouchable, a woman who chose truth over fear. The silence after Angela's words felt endless, like the whole courtroom had forgotten how to breathe. The badge sat on the railing, gleaming under the harsh lights, and her uniform jacket lay crumpled at her feet. Stripped of her symbols, Angela Carter stood taller than she ever had before. For a moment, even Judge Hayes seemed stunned. His gavel hovered in the air, then lowered without a strike. His eyes, usually guarded, professional, flickered with something human. Finally, he cleared his throat. "This court will recess. 30 minutes. The spell broke. Reporters bolted for the hallway, scribbling notes and dialing phones. The gallery erupted into murmurs. Some called Angela a hero. Others hissed, "Traitor." One woman wiped tears from her eyes and whispered, "That's courage." And Daniel Brooks exploded from his chair, slamming the defense table. "Your Honor, this is unacceptable. A theatrical stunt designed to sway the jury," but Judge Hayes silenced him with a firm look. "Sit down, Mr. Brooks." His voice carried the weight of finality. Angela bent to gather her jacket, but left the badge where it lay. She knew she would never wear it again. The hallway was chaos. Flashes popped, microphones shoved toward her face, questions hurled one after another. "Are you resigning? Do you regret what you said? Do you consider yourself a whistleblower?" Angela raised a hand, her jaw set. "No comment," she murmured, forcing her way through the crush of reporters. When she stepped outside, the scene was even wilder. Protesters cheered her name, their signs waving "Justice for all, end police abuse." Some reached for her hand, as if she were a symbol of hope made flesh. Across the street, though, a line of officers stood rigid, arms crossed, faces cold. One spat on the pavement, another muttered just loud enough, "Traitor." Angela's stomach twisted. She had once called those men brothers. Now they looked at her like an enemy. When the court reconvened, the air had changed. The jurors glanced at Angela with uncertainty, as if unsure how to measure what they had seen. Brooks struggled to recover, his arguments sharper but less confident. Rachel Moore, on the other hand, carried new energy. She questioned witnesses with clarity and conviction, as though Angela's act had fueled her. Angela sat quietly, no longer in uniform, just a woman on a witness bench. And yet, she had never felt more visible. When the day's session ended, Angela slipped out through a side exit. The October sun had already begun to dip, washing Memphis in shades of orange and violet. She walked alone to her car, her mind heavy with what she had unleashed. Her phone buzzed constantly, some messages of gratitude from strangers, others from angry colleagues. One text read only 2 words, "You're finished." She hesitated before dialing her brother. Marcus answered quickly, his voice cautious. "Angie?" "I did it," she whispered. "I left it all behind." There was silence, then a long exhale. "I saw it on the news. Angie, you don't know what that means. You spoke for people like me, for all of us who never had a chance." Tears stung her eyes. "They'll come after me." "Yeah," Marcus admitted, "but they can't take your soul. You finally made the badge mean something." By the next morning, her face was on every screen. Local and national outlets replayed the moment again and again. Some praised her as brave, a whistleblower. Others labeled her reckless, unprofessional. The Memphis Police Department released a statement. "Officer Angela Carter is under review. The department does not condone public displays of insubordination." Her phone filled with calls, journalists hungry for interviews, civil rights groups offering thanks, and anonymous voices dripping with hate. One message snarled, "You'll regret this. You should have kept quiet." Angela's pulse quickened as she listened. She saved the voicemail. Proof, she thought. Proof of what truth costs. That evening, Rachel Moore knocked on her apartment door. Angela opened it to find the prosecutor looking exhausted but resolute. "You did something remarkable today," Rachel said as she stepped inside. "Or foolish," Angela muttered, sinking into a chair. Rachel shook her head. "You reminded the jury this case isn't about technicalities. It's about whether we're willing to face the truth. You gave people something to believe in." Angela rubbed her temples. "And what happens to me now? The department will destroy me." "Maybe," Rachel admitted softly. "But don't underestimate the power of what you did. You shifted the ground under their feet." For the first time all day, Angela felt a flicker of hope. That night, Angela sat by her window, watching the city lights shimmer along the Mississippi. Her neighborhood was quiet, but she couldn't shake the sense of eyes on her. She thought of the officers glaring across the courthouse steps, the venom in the messages on her phone. Fear crept in, but she forced herself to whisper into the dark, "You don't own me anymore." She wasn't speaking to the badge. She was speaking to the system that had tried to bind her. The words steadied her. Angela Carter had crossed the line, and there was no turning back. She didn't know what the future would bring. Threats, isolation, maybe even danger. But she knew one thing with certainty. She had chosen justice. And for the first time in years, she felt free. The following week unfolded like a storm with no eye, a chaos that seemed to grow louder with each passing day. Every morning, Angela woke to the sight of her own face on the television. News anchors replayed the footage of her stripping off her badge again and again, analyzing it as though it were a scene in a film rather than a real act of defiance. Commentators argued endlessly, some praising her courage, others calling her reckless and dangerous. Strangers recognized her in grocery stores and at gas stations. Some smiled and whispered words of thanks, while others scowled and muttered insults under their breath. Her phone never stopped buzzing. Invitations poured in from civil rights organizations who wanted her to speak at rallies, from radio shows eager to hear her opinion. But for every message of support came another that dripped with menace. Anonymous numbers left voicemails that chilled her to the bone, threats that they knew where she lived, warnings that she would pay for turning against the department, voices heavy with hate. She began to change her daily routine, taking different routes home, locking her doors twice, checking over her shoulder whenever she walked at night. She had carried a gun for 12 years, yet for the first time, she felt more like prey than protector. Though she had not officially resigned, Angela knew she no longer belonged in the precinct. When she entered the building to clean out her locker, conversations died instantly. Officers who had once laughed with her over late-night coffee turned their backs, whispering in corners. Her locker had been defaced with crude words: rat, traitor, dead woman walking. She peeled away the tape without a word, her stomach tightening as she did. One officer she had trained with walked past without so much as a glance. Another muttered darkly, "Better hope you never need backup." Angela gathered her belongings in silence, a spare pair of boots, a photograph of herself and Marcus on the day she graduated from the academy, and the empty badge holder she would never wear again. Closing the locker door one last time, she walked out of the precinct without looking back, the sound of her own footsteps echoing in her ears. That evening, she drove to Marcus's apartment, a small, worn building on the edge of town. The paint peeled, the stairs creaked, but the porch light glowed warmly in the dusk. Marcus opened the door and pulled her into a hug before she could say a word. "You look like you've been through a war," he said. "Feels like it," she admitted softly. They sat together at his kitchen table, the faint smell of fried chicken lingering in the air. She told him about the fallout, the stares in the street, the threats left on her phone, the silence of colleagues who once called her sister. Marcus leaned back, listening carefully, his eyes dark with memories. "When I was locked up," he said, his voice low, "the worst part wasn't the food or the bars or even the years they stole. It was knowing the system didn't care if I was innocent. It was built to crush me, and nobody in it wanted to listen." Angela lowered her gaze. "I thought if I wore the badge I could change that." Marcus reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "You did more than I ever could. You stood in their house, on their stage, and you told the truth. Don't underestimate that." In the days that followed, Memphis seemed to divide itself in two. On one side, activists and ordinary citizens rallied around Angela, calling her the conscience of the city. Murals began to appear on brick walls downtown, her face painted in bold colors, the words "Justice First" scrawled beneath. On the other side, the police union denounced her. A spokesperson appeared on television, his voice cold with anger as he insisted she had betrayed her oath and endangered her fellow officers. His words carried authority, but Angela recognized the fear behind them. The courthouse steps became a battleground, demonstrators gathering each day. Some held signs with her name, chanting for reform. Others shouted insults, their voices sharp with fury, branding her a traitor to the uniform. The noise followed her everywhere. One evening, as Angela left the courthouse, she found Daniel Brooks waiting near her car. His suit was immaculate, his smile polite, but his eyes burned with a cruel glint. "Quite the performance last week," he said. Angela's jaw tightened. "I told the truth." Brooks chuckled, shaking his head. "Truth is a slippery thing. You've stirred up a storm, but storms pass. When this is over, you'll find yourself very much alone." He leaned closer, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You think these protesters will stand with you when the cameras are gone? They won't. And the department? They've already written you off. You're a ghost, Carter. You just don't know it yet." Angela held his gaze, refusing to look away. "If being a ghost means not living a lie," she said evenly, "then I'll take it." For a brief second, his smile faltered. Then he turned and walked away, his words trailing behind like smoke. That night, she couldn't shake his voice from her head. Sleep eluded her. She sat by the window, the city lights glimmering faintly in the distance, her heart pounding at every creak of the building. She thought of the officers who had glared at her outside the courthouse, of the threats on her phone, of Brooks's warning. Fear seeped in, heavy and relentless, yet beneath it all there lingered something stronger. The memory of those who had reached out to her in gratitude, the mural downtown, Marcus's steady voice when he told her she had done what he never could. She whispered into the darkness, "You don't own me anymore." She wasn't speaking to the badge she had left behind. She was speaking to the system that had once claimed her. The words steadied her. Back in court, Angela began to notice subtle shifts. Jurors leaned closer when Rachel questioned her. They scribbled notes more quickly, as though listening with renewed attention. Even Judge Hayes, though ever composed, seemed sharper, his questions more pointed. Her testimony no longer felt like words thrown into an endless void. It felt like seeds, fragile but alive, beginning to take root. Outside the courtroom, however, the threats only grew louder. Each night brought new messages, harsher warnings. Angela kept her weapon close, her doors locked, but she understood now that fear alone could not dictate her choices anymore. One evening after leaving Marcus's apartment, Angela walked past a group of teenagers gathered on a corner, their voices hushed, their eyes wary. A girl no older than 16 caught Angela's gaze. "You're her," the girl whispered. "You're the cop who spoke up." Angela hesitated, then nodded. The girl gave a shy smile. "My brother got locked up last year for something he didn't do. Nobody listens. But when I saw you on the news, I felt like maybe someone finally did." The words struck Angela more deeply than she expected. She walked away with the girl's face lingering in her mind, the quiet hope in her eyes. For the first time since that fateful day in court, Angela felt something stronger than fear. She felt purpose. She had lost her badge, her standing, and perhaps even her safety. But in Memphis, as the city wrestled with the meaning of her defiance, Angela began to realize she had gained something far more enduring, the power of truth and the courage to carry it. The storm raged around her still, but she knew now that she would not weather it alone. The days rolled forward with the weight of a drumbeat, each one heavier than the last. Angela Carter felt as though she had stepped out of her old life and into an uncharted wilderness. Every newspaper, every local broadcast carried her face. Commentators dissected her motives, some with admiration, others with venom. Talk radio buzzed with callers who praised her as a woman of conscience, while others spat that she had betrayed her own. Even casual conversations in diners or barbershops circled back to her name, as if the city itself could not stop turning her decision over and over like a stone in its hand. At first, Angela tried to ignore the noise, but it was impossible. A simple trip to the corner store became an ordeal. Some strangers smiled warmly, thanking her for her courage, while others muttered curses just loud enough for her to hear. One man even followed her down an aisle, whispering threats until she turned sharply and stared him down. He walked away laughing, but the echo of his words clung to her skin like smoke. She found herself scanning every crowd, every face, looking for danger. Years of training had taught her to be alert. Now she felt it consuming her. The department made its stance clear. An official letter arrived at her apartment, cold and impersonal, informing her that she had been placed on indefinite suspension pending internal review. Angela read the words twice before setting the letter on her kitchen table. She had expected it, but the finality still cut deep. For 12 years, the department had been her world. The badge had been her identity. And now, in a few short lines of bureaucratic language, it was gone. She sat for a long time in the dim light of her apartment, the letter in front of her, wondering how to rebuild a life when the foundation had been stripped away. Marcus became her anchor. She visited him often, sitting at his kitchen table long into the night, the two of them sharing stories, laughter, and sometimes silence. He had always been her older brother, the one who teased her, protected her, and carried the wounds of his wrongful conviction with quiet dignity. Now their roles seemed reversed. She was the one bearing scars, and Marcus was the one steadying her. "You're stronger than you think," he told her one evening, his voice soft but firm. "They can strip away the badge, but they can't strip away what you've done. People are listening now. People who never thought they'd be heard." Angela wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that her act of defiance had planted something larger than herself, something that could not be erased. But the system was not going to surrender quietly. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. The police union filed formal complaints against her. Rumors circulated in the press, painting her as unstable, even suggesting she had a personal vendetta against the department because of Marcus's past. Angela recognized the tactic, immediately discredit the messenger, and the message itself would lose power. She told herself not to care, but each headline felt like a blade. One evening, she turned off the television mid-broadcast, unable to listen to another panel of strangers speculate about her motives, as though she were a character in a play rather than a living woman with a beating heart. Rachel Moore remained one of the few steady voices in her corner. The prosecutor met with Angela after court sessions, offering quiet encouragement and updates on the case. "They're trying to bury you under noise," Rachel said one afternoon as they sat together in a quiet cafe. "But don't forget the jury saw you. They heard you. That can't be undone." Angela nodded, grateful for the words, though doubt still gnawed at her. "What if it isn't enough?" she asked. Rachel held her gaze. "Then at least you'll know you told the truth. That's more than most ever do." Despite Rachel's reassurance, the threats intensified. Angela began receiving letters slipped under her door, some filled with crude slurs, others with veiled warnings. Once, she found a dead rat left on the hood of her car, a sick message written on a scrap of paper beneath it. "Snitches get buried." She reported it, but no investigation followed. The silence from the department was deafening. For the first time in her life, Angela understood what it meant to be entirely on her own. Yet, in the midst of fear, there were moments of light. At a small community center in South Memphis, a group of mothers invited her to speak. Angela hesitated at first, nervous that her presence would draw hostility, but when she walked through the doors, she was met with warmth. The mothers, many of whom had lost children to violence or unjust arrests, embraced her. They thanked her for her courage, for daring to say aloud what so many had felt for years. One woman pressed Angela's hands in her own and whispered, "My son was taken from me because nobody wanted to tell the truth. You did. For that, I'll always be grateful." Angela left the center with tears stinging her eyes, the weight of their gratitude both humbling and overwhelming. For the first time, she began to understand that her act had not only changed her own life, it had rippled outward, touching lives she might never fully know. Still, the cost was high. Her apartment felt less like a home and more like a bunker. Each night she double-checked the locks, kept her service weapon within reach, and slept lightly, her ears tuned to every sound. She caught herself imagining footsteps outside her door, shadows at her window. Fear was a constant companion, sitting with her in silence. Sometimes she would call Marcus late at night, just to hear his voice steady her. "You're not alone, Angie," he reminded her. "You might feel like it, but you're not." The trial pressed forward, slow and grinding. Each day, Angela returned to the courthouse, slipping through side entrances to avoid the shouting crowds. Inside, the weight of eyes followed her, but she no longer bowed beneath it. She testified again, her voice firmer now, less hesitant. The jurors listened, pens scratching as though they wanted to capture every word. Rachel's questions guided her gently, allowing Angela to tell the truth in full. Brooks attacked her relentlessly, but Angela no longer wavered. She had already lost everything the system could take from her. What was left was untouchable. One evening, as she walked to her car, she passed a group of teenagers lingering on the sidewalk. Their conversation stopped abruptly when they saw her. Angela braced herself, expecting insults, but instead one of them stepped forward. "You're the cop who spoke up," the boy said. His voice held no mockery, only quiet respect. "My cousin got locked up last year for something he didn't do. Seeing you, it makes me think maybe things can change." Angela felt her throat tighten, unable to speak. She simply nodded and walked on. But the boy's words echoed inside her long after she drove away. In that moment, she understood the true measure of her defiance. It was not about her reputation or her career. It was about the people who needed to know that someone, at least once, had refused to stay silent. The storm had not passed. If anything, it had grown darker, the thunder rolling closer each day. But Angela Carter no longer measured her life by the uniform she had worn or the approval she had lost. She measured it by the truth she carried, fragile and dangerous, yet alive. And though she stood at the edge of uncertainty, she knew with a clarity that surprised her, she would not step back. Angela Carter had thought the storm had already reached its peak, but she was wrong. The week that followed proved that the system had not yet shown its full teeth. One morning, she woke to the sharp rap of a fist against her door. When she opened it, an envelope slid across the floor, sealed with no name, no return address. Inside was a single photograph, her walking home the night before. Her head turned slightly, as though she had heard something behind her. Beneath the picture, Scrawled in thick black marker were the words, "We're watching." Angela stood frozen, the photo trembling in her hands. For years, she had been the one knocking on doors, delivering warnings, investigating threats. Now, she was the one hunted. She called the department out of habit, reporting the incident, but the response was thin, almost dismissive. "We'll make a note of it," the voice on the other end said flatly. That was all. She hung up knowing she was on her own. She spent the day with the curtains drawn, her service weapon on the table within reach. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed heavier than usual, the silence sharp. It would have been easy to crumble under the fear, but Angela refused. If they wanted to scare her back into silence, they had underestimated just how much she had already lost. The trial continued, and each day she walked into the courthouse felt like stepping into an arena. The protesters outside grew in number, some carrying signs that read, "Stand with Angela," while others shouted insults, their voices dripping with venom. The courthouse steps had become a stage where the city's divisions played out. One morning she overheard a man scream, "Traitor, you don't deserve to live," as she hurried through the side entrance. It shook her, but it did not stop her. Inside, the courtroom remained a crucible. Brooks, relentless as ever, sought to dismantle her every word. He painted her as a bitter woman driven by her brother's past, not by conscience. He waved Marcus's old case file like a weapon, suggesting her testimony was nothing more than vengeance. Angela sat still, refusing to let him see the fire in her chest, though her hands trembled under the table. When Rachel objected, Judge Hayes sustained, but the damage lingered in the air. Later that evening, Angela met Marcus at his apartment. She slumped into a chair, exhaustion pulling at her bones. "They're using your past against me," she admitted, her voice cracking. Marcus sighed, his jaw tightening. "Let them," he said firmly. "If they want to drag me into this, fine. I've lived with their lies before. But don't you dare let them twist it into a reason for you to stop. What you're doing isn't about me, it's about all of us." His words steadied her. She realized then that Marcus, despite the years stolen from him, carried a strength she had never fully seen before. The backlash spread beyond the courtroom. News programs aired heated debates, splitting the city further. Some called Angela a hero, a whistleblower who had risked everything for justice. Others painted her as unstable, untrustworthy, a woman trying to settle personal scores. Letters poured into her mailbox, some filled with gratitude, others with hate so vile it turned her stomach. One night she returned home to find her front door defaced with spray paint. Rat. She scrubbed the word away with shaking hands, the fumes of paint burning her nose. Neighbors watched from their windows but said nothing. Angela felt the sting of isolation sharper than ever. The system hadn't just turned its back on her, it had convinced others to do the same. Still, there were moments that kept her going. At the grocery store, an elderly man stopped her in the aisle, his eyes kind. "My grandson," he said softly, "was beaten by officers last year. Nobody would listen. When you spoke up, I felt like maybe the truth still matters." He squeezed her hand, and she carried his words with her like a shield. As the weeks stretched on, Angela grew used to the rhythm of fear. She checked under her car before getting in. She memorized the exits of every building she entered, yet she refused to vanish. When Rachel suggested they request protective custody, Angela shook her head. "If I hide, they win," she said. "If they silence me, even for a little while, they'll twist the story until no one remembers why I spoke in the first place." Rachel didn't argue further, though concern shadowed her face. Judge Hayes remained a quiet presence in the trial, his gavel steady, his eyes watchful. Angela often wondered what he thought of her, whether he admired her courage or considered her reckless. Once, during a recess, their eyes met across the courtroom. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as though acknowledging something deeper than the proceedings allowed. It was a fleeting moment, but it carried her through the day. One night as she drove home along a quiet stretch of road, headlights flared in her rearview mirror. A black truck trailed close, its engine loud, its presence menacing. Angela's pulse quickened. She slowed. The truck slowed. She sped up. It matched her pace. She reached for her phone but stopped herself. Calling the department would only add another useless report to a growing pile. She gripped the wheel tighter, turning down a side street. The truck followed. Finally, at an intersection, it swerved suddenly and roared past her, disappearing into the dark. Angela sat at the stoplight, her hands trembling, her breath shallow. The message had been clear. We can reach you any time. That night, she called Marcus, her voice shaking. They're trying to break me, she admitted. They won't stop. Marcus's voice came steady over the line. Then you don't stop either. Angie, you've already done what most people are too afraid to do. Don't let them undo it now. His words wrapped around her like armor, fragile but necessary. In court the next morning, she held her head high. Brooks attacked her again, his voice dripping with disdain, but Angela no longer shrank beneath it. She answered firmly, her gaze unwavering. She knew that outside these walls, threats waited. But here, in this room, her words still mattered, and she would not waste them. The jury listened, pens moving. Rachel guided her with precision. And though Brooks sneered, though the gallery muttered, though the weight of the system pressed down on her shoulders, Angela Carter remained standing. She had lost her badge, her colleagues, and perhaps even her safety. But she still had her voice. And in a city fractured by doubt and fear, that voice had become more powerful than she had ever imagined. Angela Carter was not naive. She knew the storm was far from over. She knew darker days might still come, that the threats might grow sharper, the dangers more real. Yet as she walked out of the courthouse that day, the autumn air crisp against her face, she felt something unexpected. Not peace, not relief, but resolve. She would not be silenced. Not now. Not ever. Angela Carter had once thought that speaking the truth would be the hardest part, but she soon discovered that surviving it was far more difficult. The system had been rattled by her defiance, and now it was moving with ruthless precision to erase her, to smear her until nothing she said could carry weight. The first blow came from the media. One evening, she sat in Marcus's living room, the television flickering against the dim walls. A well-dressed commentator on a national news network leaned forward, his tone sharp as he questioned her motives. What we have here, he declared, is not an act of courage but of vengeance. Angela Carter's brother served time for a conviction that was later overturned, and now she is lashing out at the department that arrested him. This is not bravery, it's bitterness, dressed up as morality. The other panelists nodded along, their words slicing through her like knives. Marcus, sitting beside her, shook his head and grabbed the remote. Turn it off, he said. They don't get to define you. But Angela had already seen enough. The tactic was clear. Reduce her to nothing more than a bitter sister, strip her of credibility, and the truth she carried would collapse under the weight of doubt. The smear campaign intensified. Old photographs of her surfaced online, twisted into memes mocking her. Anonymous blogs published fabricated stories of her being unstable, even violent. A false rumor spread that she had once been under psychiatric evaluation, though no such record existed. The lies multiplied like wildfire, and though Angela tried to ignore them, she could feel the eyes of strangers shift when they recognized her in public. Admiration had once greeted her in hushed words of thanks. Now suspicion followed close behind. The attacks didn't stop at character assassination. Legal maneuvers began to emerge. The department filed a motion questioning her credibility as a witness, citing personal bias stemming from family history. Brooks, with his polished smile and sharp tongue, seized on it in court, presenting her not as a whistleblower but as a vindictive officer seeking revenge. Rachel fought back fiercely, arguing that truth is not invalidated by the past, but Angela could see the strain in her eyes. The battle was no longer just about the facts of the case. It had become a war for narrative, a struggle to decide which story the jury and the public would believe. At night, the threats sharpened. Her phone buzzed with messages more sinister than before. Photos of her apartment building taken from across the street, voicemails of heavy breathing, and once, the sound of a gun being cocked before the line went dead. She filed reports, but no arrests were made. The silence of the department grew louder with each passing day. Angela realized that the same system meant to protect her was now standing back, perhaps even hoping fear would drive her into retreat. But something unexpected began to happen. As the system pressed harder to crush her, ordinary people began to rise. At community meetings, pastors spoke her name with reverence, calling her a reminder that justice demanded sacrifice. Small businesses placed handwritten signs in their windows. We stand with Angela. At one church service, an elderly woman stood up during prayer and thanked God for the officer who chose truth over silence. The city was fracturing, yes, but it was also awakening. Where once there had been quiet despair, now there were voices refusing to be ignored. Angela felt the shift most clearly one afternoon when she visited a local community center. She had been invited to speak, though she hesitated, fearful of drawing more attention. But when she stepped inside, she was met not with hostility but with applause. The room was filled with families, mothers, fathers, children, many of whom had lived through the weight of injustice themselves. They listened as she spoke haltingly about her decision, about the cost of telling the truth. When she finished, a teenage boy raised his hand. "Doesn't it scare you?" he asked softly. "To have everybody against you?" Angela paused, the question heavier than any she had heard in court. "Yes," she admitted. "It scares me every single day. But fear doesn't mean you stop. Fear means you understand the risk, and you keep going anyway." The boy nodded slowly, and she could see something shift in his eyes, a spark she recognized as hope. The system struck back harder after that. Her landlord received an anonymous call, warning that keeping her as a tenant would cause problems. Days later, she found an eviction notice taped to her door. Marcus insisted she stay with him, and she did, though she worried about putting him in danger. He waved off her concerns. "We've both been fighting this system our whole lives," he said. "If they want to come at us, let them. We're stronger together." Still, the weight pressed down. Angela woke in the night from dreams of sirens and shadows, her chest tight, her skin damp with sweat. She wondered if she had underestimated the power of the machine she had defied. Could one woman truly make a dent in something so vast, so determined to protect itself? Yet every time doubt whispered, she remembered the faces of those who had thanked her, the murals downtown, the young girl who had told her that someone had finally listened. Those memories were her armor. In the courtroom, Rachel continued to fight with precision and fire, but the opposition was relentless. Brooks painted Angela as an outlier, a lone voice whose defiance proved nothing more than disloyalty. Yet Angela noticed something subtle. The jurors listened closely. Some nodded faintly when she spoke. They had heard her moment of defiance, seen her strip herself of the uniform, and though Brooks tried to bury it under rhetoric, Angela could tell it lingered in their minds. Outside the courthouse one evening, Angela was approached by a group of young activists. They carried signs, their faces determined. "We're organizing a march," one of them said. "We want you to know we're with you. You're not alone in this." Angela felt a lump rise in her throat. She had expected isolation, had braced herself for abandonment. Instead, she was finding allies in places she had never looked before. The threats did not stop, and the nights were still long. But Angela began to feel something she had not felt in weeks: strength. Not the kind that came from the badge or the uniform, but the kind that came from knowing she had spoken the truth and that others had heard it. It was fragile, yes, but it was real. As autumn deepened, the air grew colder, the leaves falling in bursts of red and gold. Angela walked the streets of Memphis with her shoulders squared, her steps deliberate. The storm still raged around her, but she was no longer only bracing against it. She was moving through it, carrying her truth like a lantern against the dark. The system wanted her erased, silenced, forgotten. But Angela Carter was still here. And with every passing day, more voices joined hers, refusing to be quiet any longer. Angela Carter had thought she understood the price of defiance, but as the trial stretched into its fourth month, she learned that the system had many ways to break someone. Her name was dragged through television screens and radio shows until it felt less like a person and more like a weapon. Commentators questioned her sanity, her motives, even her past. A former colleague appeared on a local station, his voice smooth as he claimed Angela had always been emotional and couldn't handle the job. Betrayal cut deep, not because of his words, but because she had once trusted him. Her financial life unraveled next. Without her paycheck, bills stacked up like an accusation. She had some savings, but they dwindled quickly, and when her landlord moved forward with eviction, she packed her belongings into boxes. Marcus carried them into his small apartment, making space where there was little. "We'll manage," he told her, though she saw the worry in his eyes. At night, lying awake on his couch, Angela whispered to herself, "They won't break me," until the words became her prayer. In court, Brooks continued his relentless assault. He wielded Marcus's wrongful conviction like a weapon, suggesting Angela's testimony was nothing more than revenge. Rachel countered fiercely, but the fight was uneven. Still, Angela noticed something in the jurors' eyes. They leaned closer when she spoke, their pens moving faster. She sensed that some part of her defiance still lingered in their minds, a seed refusing to be buried. Outside the courthouse, the city pulsed with tension. Protests grew larger, some chanting her name, others shouting her down as a traitor. Police stood watch, their presence heavy, their faces cold. Angela often slipped quietly into the crowd, hood pulled low, watching as ordinary people risked their voices. It filled her with awe. They weren't just marching for her, they were marching for themselves, for every injustice swallowed by silence. Marcus made sure she saw that clearly. One evening, he brought her to a community meeting in a church basement. The air buzzed with determination as pastors, teachers, and activists planned their next march. When Angela entered, the room hushed. She wanted to retreat, but Marcus's hand held her steady. A middle-aged woman rose and spoke. "You gave us a spark. We're the fire. Don't forget that." Applause shook the walls, and Angela felt something shift inside her chest. For weeks, she had felt hunted and alone. Now, for the first time, she felt the weight of solidarity. The threats did not stop. A brick shattered Marcus's window one night, a note tied to it reading, "This is just the beginning." Fear surged through Angela, but Marcus swept the glass aside with anger, not despair. "They think they can scare us back into silence," he said. "They're wrong." His words hardened her resolve, though she worried constantly about putting him in danger. When she confessed her guilt, Marcus shook his head. "They already stole years from me. Don't let them steal your courage too." Despite the fear, there were moments that carried her. At the grocery store, an elderly man pressed her hand and whispered that his grandson had been beaten by police. "When you spoke up," he said, "I felt like truth still mattered." At a protest, a teenager told her she gave him hope that the future could be different. These encounters reminded her that her defiance was no longer just her burden. It had become a symbol for others. As winter settled over Memphis, Angela walked the streets with her coat pulled tight, her breath curling in the cold air. She knew the system was vast and unyielding, that it would not stop until it erased her or silenced her completely. Yet she also knew something had changed. The city was awake. Angela Carter, stripped of her badge, burdened by threats, no longer walked alone. She carried with her the voices of those who refused to be quiet any longer. And that, she realized, was more powerful than any uniform she had ever worn. Angela Carter had once imagined that the hardest part of her fight would be the moment she tore the badge from her chest, but she was wrong. That had been only the beginning. By the time the trial neared its decisive phase, she felt as though the city of Memphis itself had been split down the middle, and her name was the fault line. Every morning the news carried fresh speculation. Reporters outside the courthouse camped day and night, cameras always ready, their lenses tracking her every step. Commentators debated endlessly, was she a courageous truth-teller or a bitter traitor? The system understood the power of narrative, and they wielded it mercilessly. One evening, Angela sat with Marcus watching a national program. The panelists spoke of her as though she were a ghost who wasn't sitting just a few miles away. "She's compromised," one insisted. "She has no credibility. Her family history disqualifies her from objectivity." Another chimed in, "This isn't courage, it's vendetta." Marcus reached for the remote, his jaw clenched. "They're afraid of you, Angie," he said. "That's why they're so loud." She tried to smile, but the words lodged inside her like thorns. It was one thing to stand against the department. It was another to be dismantled publicly, piece by piece. The pressure mounted in court as well. Brooks moved with the precision of a predator, circling her testimony, striking whenever he sensed weakness. He dragged Marcus's wrongful conviction into the light again and again, suggesting Angela's entire stance was built on bitterness. He looked at the jury as if to say, "You can't trust her, she's tainted." Rachel fought tirelessly, objecting, countering, reframing, but Angela could see the strain in her eyes. This was not just a trial about misconduct anymore. It was a war for control of the truth. Outside the courthouse, the protests swelled. Streets that once held only a handful of demonstrators now roared with chants. Some carried Angela's name on signs, their voices fierce with hope. Others shouted curses, branding her a traitor to the uniform. Police formed lines at every rally, their presence heavy, their expression stone. The city had become a stage, and Angela, its reluctant centerpiece. At times, she tried to slip unnoticed through the streets, her hood drawn low. But anonymity was impossible. A woman once stopped her at a bus stop, pressing her hand tightly. "My boy was beaten last year," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "Nobody believed me. But when you spoke, I felt like someone finally did." On another night, a man spat at her feet, muttering, "You've disgraced us all." Angela walked on, her shoulders squared, refusing to flinch. She had learned that the cost of truth was not only fear, but also the willingness to carry other people's rage. The threats escalated too. One morning she opened Marcus's mailbox to find an envelope stuffed with newspaper clippings, each headline about whistleblowers who had been ruined. Their careers ended, their lives shattered. Scrawled across the top in red ink were the words, "This will be you." Angela's hands shook as she showed it to Marcus. He tore it in half with a growl. "They're cowards hiding behind paper," he said. But she could see the worry in his eyes, the same worry that haunted her when she lay awake at night. Despite the fear, there were sparks of strength. The mural downtown had grown. What began as a small portrait now stretched across an entire wall. Angela standing tall, her jacket falling away, her badge left behind. Beneath it, the words, "Truth before silence." Strangers posed in front of it, their photos spreading across social media. A movement was growing, larger than Angela herself. She had not asked for it, had not sought to be a symbol, yet she had become one. At a community gathering, she felt the weight of that transformation. The church basement was filled with people, mothers clutching photos of their sons, fathers with tired eyes, teenagers whose voices trembled with both anger and hope. When Angela stood to speak, the room hushed. She told them she was afraid every day, that she had lost her job, her home, her safety, but she also told them that silence would have cost more. "Fear doesn't mean you stop," she said quietly. "Fear means you know the risk, and you keep going anyway." The room erupted in applause, and for the first time, Angela felt not like a target, but like part of something larger, something unbreakable. Yet the system did not let go. Financial pressure tightened. Legal maneuvers dragged on, and still the rumors swirled, whispers of her instability, questions about her integrity. At times, Angela wondered if the machine was too vast, if her defiance had only provoked a storm she could not survive. But then she would remember the faces in the crowd, the boy who told her she gave him hope, the elderly man who whispered thanks in the grocery store aisle. Those memories became her shield. One night after a long day in court, Angela walked alone through the quiet streets. The autumn wind cut cold against her face, carrying the scent of wood smoke and damp leaves. She thought of the badge she had left on the railing, of the years she had given to a system that now wanted her erased. And she thought of Marcus, of every family who had lost someone to silence. She stopped beneath a streetlight, her breath rising in white clouds. "I'm still here," she whispered to the night. "You can't take that from me." The storm had not passed. If anything, it was still gathering, dark and relentless. But Angela Carter, stripped of her uniform and hunted by the system she once served, now understood something deeper than she ever had before. She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was carrying a truth that belonged to all of them, a truth that could not be silenced as long as someone was willing to speak it. And she was not done speaking. The trial was no longer just a trial. By the 10th week, it had become a spectacle, a crucible where the city's conscience was being tested. Reporters lined the courthouse steps as if they were camped at the gates of history. Every word uttered inside the courtroom found its way onto television screens and headlines across the country. Memphis was no longer alone in watching Angela Carter. Now the nation had turned its eyes toward her. But with visibility came danger. The smear campaigns grew bolder. A national paper ran a front-page article questioning whether Angela had falsified reports earlier in her career. Though the accusations were baseless, the headline itself was enough to plant doubt. Commentators on primetime shows leaned into it, painting her not as a whistleblower but as a disgraced officer desperate for attention. Angela watched the coverage with a hollow ache. The truth, she realized, was fragile. It could be buried under repetition of lies. Financially, she was on the edge. Marcus had taken extra shifts at the auto shop just to help cover expenses, though he insisted he didn't mind. Angela hated it. She hated seeing him pay again for a system that had already stolen so much from him. More than once, she considered withdrawing from the case, stepping away to shield him. But each time, Marcus stopped her before she could finish the thought. "If you quit now," he told her, "they win twice, once when they broke me, and again when they broke you." The threats escalated. One night, Angela returned to Marcus's apartment to find the door ajar. Her heart seized as she stepped inside, her hand tight around her weapon. The living room was in shambles, drawers pulled open, papers scattered, furniture overturned. On the table sat a single bullet, polished and gleaming beneath the dim lamp. Taped beside it was a note. "Next time, it won't be empty." Angela's knees trembled, but she refused to cry. She called the police, though she already knew the response. An officer arrived, took a perfunctory glance, and muttered, "Probably kids messing around." He wrote a few lines in his notebook, offered no promise of follow-up, and left. Angela stood in the wreckage, her fists clenched, her breath coming in shallow bursts. The message had been clear. She was vulnerable, and the system would not protect her. That night, she sat awake on the couch, Marcus pacing the room. "They want you scared," he said, his voice sharp. "They want you to fold." Angela stared at the bullet on the table, the light glinting off its brass casing. "I am scared," she admitted softly. "But fear doesn't mean I'll stop." Marcus looked at her, pride and worry mingling in his eyes. "Then you're stronger than they know." Inside the courtroom, Brooks doubled down. His questions turned cruel, his tone dripping with disdain. He accused Angela of exploiting the trial for attention, of manipulating the public with theatrics. He even suggested that her act of removing her badge had been rehearsed, a performance designed to sway sympathy. The words cut, but Angela refused to flinch. She met his gaze squarely and said, "I didn't take that badge off for attention. I took it off because I couldn't wear it and tell the truth at the same time." The jury shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward, others scribbled notes. Angela felt the moment resonate, even as Brooks sneered. Rachel fought with relentless precision. Each time Brooks pushed, she pulled Angela back with clear, measured questions that restored the focus to facts. She reminded the court of the evidence, of the patterns of abuse, of the system that had protected itself at the cost of justice. And though Angela could see fatigue in her eyes, she also saw fire. Rachel, too, had staked something of herself in this fight. Outside, the movement surged. Marches filled the streets, their chants echoing against the city's brick walls. Truth before silence. Justice now. The mural of Angela had become a gathering place, candles flickering at its base each night. Students organized rallies, pastors preached about her courage from their pulpits, and families who had once remained silent began telling their own stories. But not all was hopeful. Counter-protests erupted as well, some fueled by anger, others by fear. Men in uniform stood with folded arms, shouting that Angela had disgraced the badge. On one particularly tense afternoon, fights broke out on the courthouse steps. The police intervened, their batons raised, and the chaos only deepened the city's fracture. Angela watched from a window, her heart heavy. She had never wanted to be a symbol, never asked to be the face of a fight larger than herself. But she could no longer separate her story from the movement it had ignited. For better or worse, she had become a vessel for voices long ignored. The national spotlight intensified the stakes. Politicians weighed in, some calling for reforms, others condemning Angela as a danger to order. Editorials clashed in major newspapers. Cable news devoted hours of coverage to the case, turning it into a proxy war for the nation's conscience. Angela felt herself stretched thin, caught between fear of what awaited her in the shadows and the impossible weight of expectation. One night, she confessed her exhaustion to Marcus. "I don't know if I can carry all of this," she whispered. "I'm just one person." Marcus sat beside her, his hands steady on hers. "You don't have to carry it all. You just have to keep standing. The rest of us will carry it with you." His words broke something open inside her. For weeks, she had felt isolated, hunted, reduced to headlines and threats. But in that moment, she remembered the faces she had seen at the church basement, the teenager who had asked if she was scared, the grandmother who had thanked her with tears in her eyes. She was not alone. She never had been. As winter deepened, so did the tension. The trial was approaching its climax, and Angela knew the system would strike hardest in the days ahead. She had lost her badge, her home, her safety, but she still had her voice. And with the nation watching, that voice carried further than she ever thought possible. On a cold December night, she stood at her window, the city lights flickering against the dark. She thought of the bullet left on the table, of the smear campaigns, of the faces of strangers who now marched in her name. Fear pulsed through her veins, but beneath it, something steadier grew. Resolve. "They can smear me, they can threaten me, they can try to erase me," she whispered to herself. "But they can't take the truth." And with that, Angela Carter braced herself for what was to come. Angela Carter had learned to live with fear, but by the time the trial entered its final stretch, fear had begun to live with her. It followed her into every corner of Marcus's apartment, whispered through the phone calls at night, clung to her like smoke she couldn't wash away, yet she refused to bow to it. Each day she rose, pulled her coat tighter, and walked into the courthouse knowing the system was sharpening its knives. The pressure from Brooks intensified beyond anything she had imagined. He no longer confined himself to the courtroom. Reporters carried his soundbites straight to the evening news, where he framed Angela as a disgruntled former officer whose bias had tainted the case. His words were crafted to bleed into public opinion, that she was not brave, but bitter, not truthful, but vengeful. Angela watched the footage with clenched fists. He was not simply trying to win a verdict, he was trying to erase her. The department joined the attack. Internal records, long sealed, suddenly leaked to the press memos in which Angela had once disagreed with superiors, complaints filed by colleagues who described her as difficult or insubordinate. None of it showed misconduct, but the implication was clear. She was unreliable. Newspapers printed the claims in bold headlines, the truth hidden in fine print. Angela recognized the tactic. It wasn't about facts. It was about drowning her in shadows until no one could see her clearly anymore. At home, the strain weighed on Marcus too. He tried to hide it, but Angela saw the fatigue in his eyes after long shifts at the shop. One evening, she found him sitting silently at the table, staring at the eviction notice still tacked to the fridge as if it were a wound that refused to heal. "I hate that you're paying for this," Angela whispered. Marcus shook his head. "I paid a long time ago. This time, at least, I'm paying for something that matters." His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. The threats became bolder. Angela woke one night to the sound of footsteps in the alley outside Marcus's apartment. She grabbed her weapon, heart hammering, and pressed against the wall, listening. A shadow moved past the window, pausing just long enough to make her skin crawl, then vanished into the darkness. When she opened the door minutes later, the alley was empty, but on the step lay another envelope. Inside was a photograph of Marcus leaving work, a red X scrawled over his chest. Angela's stomach lurched. They weren't just after her anymore. She sat awake until dawn, the photo clutched in her hands, guilt gnawing at her. When Marcus saw it, he swore under his breath and tossed it aside. "They think threats will stop us? They don't know us." Angela's voice broke. "I can take it if it's me, Marcus, but if something happens to you," he stopped her with a firm look. "Don't you dare back down. Don't you dare let them scare you into silence. If they wanted to break me, they should have done it years ago." His defiance steadied her, even as fear hollowed her chest. The city outside seemed to mirror her turmoil. Protests grew so large they shut down intersections, thousands chanting beneath banners painted with her name. Churches opened their doors for nightly vigils, candles flickering against stained glass as voices prayed for justice. But counter-protests grew too. Lines of officers stood shoulder to shoulder, their presence both defensive and menacing. Clashes broke out, arrests followed, and Memphis seemed perched on the edge of something dangerous. Angela often stood at the edge of those gatherings, hidden beneath a hood, watching. She felt both awe and unease. She had never wanted this to be the face on Murals, the name in chants, the figure people lit candles for. But she understood now that her act of defiance had unleashed something larger than her, something that belonged to the people themselves. She was both burdened and buoyed by it. In the courtroom, Rachel fought harder than ever. Her questions cut sharply, her arguments steady, her presence commanding. But Angela could see the toll it was taking. Late one evening, Rachel visited her at Marcus's apartment. She sat heavily at the kitchen table, rubbing her temples. "They're not fighting fair," she admitted. "Every time I close one door, they open another. But we're close, Angela. The jury's listening. I can see it." Angela studied her face, weary yet fierce. "Do you think we can win?" she asked quietly. Rachel met her eyes, and for the first time, Angela saw doubt flicker there. But Rachel straightened, her voice firm. "Winning isn't just a verdict. Sometimes it's surviving long enough to tell the truth out loud. You've already done that, and it matters." Angela held on to those words, even as the days grew darker. Then came the subpoena. Brooks filed a motion to compel Angela to release personal records, medical files, psychological evaluations from years past, even private correspondence. It was a naked attempt to strip her bare, to expose anything that could be twisted against her. Rachel argued fiercely to block it, but the judge, bound by procedure, allowed a portion of the request. Angela felt the walls closing in. When she told Marcus, he slammed his fist on the table. "They're digging for dirt that doesn't exist," Angela sighed. "That doesn't matter. They'll twist whatever they find." She leaned back, exhaustion heavy in her bones. "I don't know how much more I can take." Marcus leaned forward. his voice low but fierce. Then remember this. They're coming at you this hard because you scare them. They wouldn't waste the effort if you didn't matter. That night, Angela stood before the mirror, staring at her reflection. She barely recognized the woman staring back, eyes ringed with fatigue, lines of worry etched deep, shoulders tense. But beneath it all, she saw something else, a spark that refused to die. She whispered to her reflection, "They can smear me, threaten me, strip me of everything, but they can't own my truth." She thought of the bullet left on the table, the photograph marked with an X, the smear campaigns, the endless threats. And she thought of the voices in the church basement, the boy who had asked if she was scared, the grandmother who had thanked her with tears. The system wanted her erased. But those voices, they were the reason she couldn't be. As the trial edged closer to its conclusion, Memphis braced itself. The city felt like a drum stretched too tight, every beat trembling on the verge of breaking. Reporters filled the airwaves with speculation, politicians weighed in, and the people filled the streets. Angela, standing in the center of it all, understood that she was no longer just testifying in a courtroom. She was testifying for a city, for a truth that demanded to be heard. And though the storm howled louder than ever, Angela Carter walked into the courthouse each morning with her head high. She had been stripped of her badge, her safety, and nearly everything she had once called her life. But she still had her voice. And with that voice, she would carry the fight to its end. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever on the morning that would decide everything. People began lining up before dawn, wrapped in coats against the December chill, waiting for the doors to open. Reporters swarmed the steps, their cameras hungry, their voices sharp as they delivered live updates to a nation that had grown to see this trial as more than a case, it was a reckoning. Inside, the air buzzed with a tension so thick Angela felt it vibrate in her bones. She sat at the witness table, her palms pressed flat, her gaze steady but inwardly bracing. Weeks of pressure, months of threats, years of silence, it had all led to this. Rachel sat beside her, flipping through notes, her face composed but tight with exhaustion. Across the aisle, Brooks stood polished and ready, his smile that of a man confident he could bend the truth into submission. The gavel fell. Judge Hayes called the court to order. The final arguments had begun. Brooks rose first, striding before the jury with a presence honed by years of performance. His voice was smooth, his gestures precise. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "this case is not about corruption or truth. It is about loyalty. It is about an officer who allowed her personal bitterness to cloud her duty. Officer Carter is not a hero. She is a disgruntled woman who staged a spectacle, a performance designed to sway your emotions. She abandoned her badge not out of principle, but out of spite. Can you trust someone who betrays her brothers and sisters in uniform? Can you trust someone whose testimony is poisoned by vengeance?" His words slithered across the courtroom, each one crafted to pierce. Angela watched the jurors' faces, some stoic, some shifting uncomfortably. Brooks was a master at this, twisting the frame until truth seemed like a flaw. He ended with a flourish, turning toward Angela with mock pity. "She is not justice, she is chaos. And chaos has no place in a system built on order." He returned to his seat, smug, confident. Rachel rose slowly. She moved with none of Brooks's theatrical flair. Instead, she carried herself with the steady weight of conviction. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice calm but strong, "you've heard a lot of words in this courtroom, some sharp, some polished, some designed to distract. But I ask you to remember one moment, just one, when Angela Carter stood in this very room, took off her badge, and said she would rather lose her job than betray justice. That was not a performance. That was not spite. That was the truth, laid bare." She walked slowly before the jury, her eyes locking with theirs one by one. "This case is not about loyalty to an institution. It is about loyalty to the truth." Angela Carter did what few have ever dared. She chose conscience over comfort, truth over silence. The question before you is not whether she is perfect. None of us are. The question is whether you will listen to the truth, even when it costs something. And Rachel's words hung in the air, quiet but immovable. She returned to her seat without flourish, her shoulders squared. The judge called a recess before final deliberations. The jury filed out. The gallery murmured. Angela sat still, her heart pounding, the weight of Brooks's venom and Rachel's hope pressing against her chest. She could feel eyes on her from every corner, supporters, detractors, reporters ready to dissect her every breath. Then, something inside her shifted. Angela stood. The murmurs rose as she walked to the center of the courtroom, past the witness stand, past the table where her uniform jacket once sat folded. Judge Hayes looked startled. "Miss Carter," but Angela raised her hand gently. "Your Honor, I know procedure. I know I shouldn't speak now, but I also know this may be the last time anyone listens to me before the record closes. Please." The judge hesitated, his gavel poised. Then, after a long pause, he nodded. "Proceed." The room hushed, every head turning toward her. Angela drew a deep breath. "I wore that badge for 12 years. I believed in it. I believed it meant honor, protection, truth. But I also saw things I wish I hadn't. Reports rewritten, violence ignored. Innocent men and women treated like threats because it was easier than admitting mistakes. And I stayed silent. I told myself it wasn't my place, that loyalty mattered more than honesty. I betrayed my own conscience, again and again." Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. "Then my brother was taken. Marcus, arrested for something he didn't do. Years stolen from him because the system cared more about convictions than truth. I joined the force thinking I could make a difference, thinking I could stop that from happening again. But instead, I became part of the silence that allowed it to continue." She looked toward the jurors, her eyes wet but unwavering. "The day I stood here and took off my badge, it wasn't for attention. It wasn't revenge. It was because I finally realized I couldn't wear it and tell the truth at the same time. You can call me bitter, you can call me reckless, but you cannot say I lied. What I saw was real. What I testified was real, and if telling the truth makes me a traitor, then I will wear that name with pride." The room was so silent it seemed even the walls were listening. Reporters froze mid-note, pens hovering above paper. A woman in the gallery dabbed tears from her eyes. Judge Hayes leaned back, his expression unreadable but softened. Angela straightened. "This isn't about me. It's about every person who has ever been silenced because the truth was inconvenient. It's about whether we value justice enough to face what it costs. I am not chaos. I am what happens when silence finally breaks." She stepped back, her chest heaving, her hands trembling at her sides. The gallery erupted. Gasps, murmurs, some clapping before the bailiff barked for order. The jurors looked shaken, their faces pale, their pens forgotten. Brooks sputtered, rising to object, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand. "Enough, Mr. Brooks. Let the record show her words." Angela returned to her seat beside Rachel. Her knees felt weak, her pulse wild, but her spirit had never felt stronger. She had said it all. No more hiding, no more silence. Marcus sat in the gallery, his eyes shining with pride. He mouthed the words, "That's my sister." That night, as Angela left the courthouse, the streets outside were alive with noise. Protesters cheered, their chants echoing into the cold December air. Reporters shouted questions, their cameras flashing. But beneath it all, Angela felt a stillness inside her. She had faced the storm, and she had not bent. The verdict was still to come. The threats would not vanish overnight. The machine she had defied would continue to turn. But Angela Carter had reclaimed something far greater than a badge or a career. She had reclaimed her voice. And no system, however vast, could take that from her again. The verdict came on a gray December afternoon. The courthouse was wrapped in silence as the jury filed back into their seats. The judge's voice carried the familiar cadence of procedure, but beneath it, Angela could feel the tremor of history. When the words were spoken, the room seemed to exhale all at once. The officer on trial was found guilty on multiple counts: abuse of power, falsifying reports, obstruction of justice. Gasps rippled through the gallery, some triumphant, others bitter. Reporters bolted for the doors, eager to broadcast the decision across the airwaves. Angela sat still, her hands folded in her lap, her chest tight. She had prepared herself for disappointment, had braced for the possibility that the machine would swallow truth whole once again. But against all odds, the jury had listened. Her voice, fragile as it had felt, had carried. Rachel squeezed her hand under the table, her expression weary but proud. "You did it," she whispered. Angela shook her head. "We did it." Outside, the courthouse steps were a sea of people. Cheers rose as the verdict spread, chants of justice echoing against the winter sky. Reporters swarmed, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. Angela shielded her eyes, overwhelmed by the crush of sound and movement. But then she heard another voice, steady, familiar. "Angie." Marcus pushed through the crowd, his face shining with tears he didn't bother to hide. He pulled her into his arms, and for the first time in months, Angela let herself collapse into her brother's embrace. They held each other tightly, two survivors bound by pain, by loss, but also by the fragile, powerful thread of truth. The days that followed blurred with headlines. Some praised the verdict as a turning point, a rare moment of accountability. Others warned that it was only a symbolic victory, that the system itself remained intact. Angela knew both were true. The machine had not been dismantled. It still loomed, vast and unyielding. But for one moment, truth had broken through. And that mattered. She returned quietly to Marcus's apartment, her belongings still in boxes, her future uncertain. She had no badge, no job, no clear path forward. But she had something she hadn't felt in years: peace. She sat by the window at night, watching the city lights shimmer across the Mississippi, and breathed more freely than she had in a long time. In the weeks that followed, people continued to reach out. Strangers stopped her on the street to thank her. Letters arrived from across the country, teachers, pastors, mothers, veterans, all telling her that her act of defiance had given them courage. One letter, written in shaky handwriting, stayed with her most. "I'm 74 years old. I thought truth was dead in this country. You reminded me it isn't." Angela carried that letter folded in her pocket, a reminder that even when the weight of fear pressed down, her voice had reached further than she ever imagined. One evening, as winter gave way to the first signs of spring, Angela walked with Marcus through the streets of Memphis. The mural downtown had been repainted brighter now, her likeness standing tall against a backdrop of sunrise colors. Beneath it, new words had been added. One voice can start a chorus. Angela stood silently, staring at the image. She had never wanted to be painted on a wall, never wanted to be a symbol, but she understood now that symbols were not chosen. They were forged by moments when silence broke. She turned to Marcus, her voice soft. "Do you think it lasts? Do you think anything really changes?" Marcus slipped his arm around her shoulders. "Change is slow, painfully slow, but it starts somewhere, and maybe it started with you." Angela nodded, her chest swelling with both humility and hope. That night she wrote in her journal, the words flowing quietly, "I thought losing my badge meant losing myself, but it didn't. It freed me to remember who I was before the silence took hold. The badge gave me authority, but truth gave me strength, and no matter what comes, I will not give it back." Angela Carter's life would never return to what it had been. The machine she had defied still loomed, still threatened, but she had stood against it and survived. And though the path ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing with clarity: she had chosen justice. And sometimes, that choice alone was enough to change the world. My dear friends, if you've stayed with me until the very last moments, surely your heart has gone through a whirlwind of emotions: surprise, anger, compassion, even a lump in your throat at the choice made by the black female police officer. What do you think about her action? Was it admirable courage or a risky recklessness? If you were in her place, what would you do? Leave your comment below. If you believe that justice must be protected by the truth, press 1. If you feel there are still mysteries left unsolved, press 0. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you too will always stand on the side of justice, even though the path to the truth is never easy.